Hello. In today's video for Cadillac 472-500, I'm going to talk about the Acme intake. Now, later on, I'm going to do a video on homemade intakes, but this technically I consider a production intake. There was like between 22 and 25 of these intakes made. And it's called the Acme intake because that's what it says on the end of the intake. It was made by a guy, Tom Eckholt, and a lot of them I think were sold through MTS. I wasn't really involved in this at all. The intake is essentially a tunnel ram, and it has this wild look that really captures people's attention. Kind of like the old Chevy Tuneport intake where it had the runners on the outside. Now, my understanding was they were going to make even more of these intakes. I think the original run was supposed to be like 50, but when guys started getting them, they were having some trouble making them run. Now, part of the problem is if you look at this thing, this has got a very long runner. This is a 16-inch long runner. So we went from the Boogeyman intake that only had that little short, like 2.5-inch runner, to the other end of the spectrum with a 16-inch runner. Now, longer runner is better for lower end power. And there are mathematics for what the runner length is tuned to with a given displacement and runner length and cross section and all that. This particular intake is basically tuned for idle. The runner is essentially too long. Now, this is, I consider a bit of a iconic intake. It shows up, I mean, it was in the Big Inch Cadillac book. It's been on the background of a Stacy David episode where it showed up on a street rod, and it's been on various things. If this is around, whoever's doing the photography tends to put it on film because it is a wild intake. Even when I parked it back on a motor for one of my videos, one of the first questions was, hey, what's that intake back there? So it's a very looker intake, and it really captures everybody's attention. Like I said, that kind of makes it a bit iconic for me. So when I had the chance to buy this one, I went for it. I have not run this. Courtney at CAD Company has run several of these on the Dyno, and he describes it as having fuel shear problems. That means that the airspeed going through the runner is getting high enough that it's separating out the fuel. And though I've talked a lot about trying to get airspeed up, a longer runner will get the airspeed up. And you can actually go too far. If you start getting air going too fast, you got to remember it's not just air, it's air and fuel. And that fuel starts to separate out. Now, if you look at your history a little bit, you'd go to like the long ram 413 Mopar engine back in the early 60s. I think it was like 62. They had the carburetors on the side. They had big long runners that came over the motor. Now, the reason I bring that up is because when you run long runners like that and the airspeed gets up there to where you're having problems, because there are limits on how fast you can make the air. When you get there, the air also doesn't like to turn. And that's one of the problems with this, is you have a bit of a curve going on here. And even big, gentle sweeping, if the airspeed's high enough, it doesn't like to do it. It really likes straight line right to the back of the valve if you really drive up the airspeed. And that was kind of how the Chrysler wound up like it was, long straight runners. This also has another problem, which I'll get to in a minute. But we like long runners. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, but there's a happy medium. You know, the Edelbrock's like 8 inches. The Boogeyman was only 2.5, which that's too short. 8's not doing too bad for about the RPM of a 500 for the tuned length. 10 might be more appropriate. 16 is starting to get to be too long. So, like I said, the thing you want to try and do is get a long runner if you make an intake, and not make it super long and not have it, you want it fairly straight. So let me talk about this intake a little bit more. Like I said, I'm not real sure of the exact number. There was between 22 and 25 of these built. And that's a lot, really, for doing sheet metal tunnel ram intakes. That is more, there's lots of onesies out there of sheet metal intakes that have been made for the Cadillac. Some are homemade, some are decently made. The only other one that I can think of that was kind of production would have been Potter's. He made some before he made the Boogeyman intake, but I think he only made like 6 or less. And like I said, this is up there. This is up there like 25. And 50 would have been even cooler to have more kicking around. So you will run across these. Now, a couple of things. First off, if you find one, they are numbered down here on the corner. This one is number 17. And so you can tell where it was in its production. The runners on these are straight, not straight, but not tapered. A little bit of taper might have helped this intake a bit. But these runners are basically keeping the stock port size all the way up through. And because it's the stock port size, it flows 264, which is about all the port area of a stock head will carry. And so I really wish that maybe he had put just a little bit of taper. That would have effectively shortened the runner and made the intake probably a little more usable. Now, the other problem I want to show you is if you kind of look here at the flange, this runner comes down and then it heads down parallel with the flange on the end. And this is a very common mistake for most of the Cadillac intakes. And I've talked about you have that bump and you have a port that's actually turned downward. So again, we have a runner that's pointing downward and a port that's pointing downward, and that little squiggle with high airspeed just makes a problem. You can't have that. I have debated maybe trying to fill this in on this intake and make it a straighter shot and a raised runner, but again, it's kind of an iconic intake, and I don't think I want to fuss with this. I want to kind of leave it like it is because, you know, it was made, it's got a history, you know, they were around, and so I don't really want to fuss with this. Now, some things he did kind of interesting. I've talked about the bump on the heads for the valve cover. This particular intake is notched on the flange to try and clear those bumps. It's probably easier if you take the bump off personally, but I'm sure he was trying to make it so it would just bolt on to any Cadillac. This would work okay for a street rod, say, something that you're keeping the RPM down. Now, like I said, this intake was run in the Big Inch Cadillac book, and they claimed it made 601 foot-pounds and 418 horsepower, as compared to the Edelbrock, which made 435 horsepower and 591 foot-pounds. So the longer runner, you can see, certainly pushed the RPM band down from where the Edelbrock was, which generates more torque. But they also kind of said something in there about tilt, because they basically couldn't test low enough in order to really find out where peak torque was. And like I said, if you do the math on it, this thing is tuned for like 1,000 RPM. And so it'll have brutal right off idle response. It'll seem really great. It'll probably be a little bit better in torque than the Edelbrock will. And then it's going to fall flat on its face and give you problems. And the Edelbrock will kind of keep going. So it's amazing to say, but a dual plane Edelbrock will actually make more horsepower, more top end, than this intake with a dual quad will. And so that's kind of an interesting thing about this intake. Now, like I said, if you run across one, think street rod, think something that never going to see a lot of RPM. You want it to look cool. You want it to be strictly low end power. You don't care about anything, maybe even above 3,500, and call it done. Now, there's one more piece I want to bring up on this intake. There were a few made, I've seen pictures, of a single carburetor version of this. If you have that, I recommend you cut out the intake and make a new top to maybe bolt on here and convert it to dual carb. The reason is a single carb in the middle is going to have a lot of troubles with fuel distribution, just like we talked about on the Boogeyman intake. So you'll wind up with these ones running rich and these ones running lean. And so you're going to be much better off with two small carburetors on this. I would probably run maybe two 500 Edelbrocks or something small in a Holly. I'm not sure how much room you have in here for a big fuel bowl of a Holly. So like I said, I'm kind of thinking two 500 Edelbrocks. And that's how I've seen most of them. These are very well constructed. The guy did a beautiful job making these. They're nicely machined. There looks like it's a lot of CNC parts. They're very nicely welded. They're very nicely cleaned up. I mean, it's a beautiful intake. So, like I said, if you run across one of these somewhere, I mean, it should stand out from across the room. So if you see one in a swap meet or see one posted somewhere, you can know what it is and see what kind of deal you can get and maybe use it on a street rod or sell it to a guy that wants it for a street rod. Now, because it's fuel problem related, I did have one thought on this I want to share, and that's it might do better as a fuel injected intake. If you were to actually put fuel injection on here and run it that way to where all this is dry, you might get rid of that fuel shear and distribution problems, and that might get a little more out of it. So that's one idea. I did see, and I should tell you, when he stopped making the intake, he still had parts. So he sold off a few kits, call them, parts to make your own. And so there are a few ones out there, and they won't have his number on them, and they probably will not even say Acme on them, but that are going to be kind of homemade. And I did see one that was that way, that was fuel injected, but I never could find anybody that ran it in order to know how well it did. I would have been very interested to see if it did better on fuel injected. But that's a quick description of the Acme intake. Like I said, very iconic. There were certainly many made. This isn't the only one. And if you find one, might want to snag it even if you're going to sell it. So anyway, that's the Acme intake. We'll talk to you on another one.